your response to what I asked. Senator Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you for holding this hearing. This has been fascinating. I wish I could have spent more time here, but I did hear the testimony. Dr. Burns, I always like starting out with the macro. Okay, let's take a look at the overall industry. Latest information I have, according to the AMA, in 2021, we spent about $4.3 trillion on health care. Is that?
We're over $4 trillion, that's correct.
And also about $577 billion on pharmaceuticals, gross, total.
It depends on how you measure retail versus institutional.
So what do you think? What do you think the number is?
Well, it could be, if you look just at the retail numbers that come out of CMS, people will say, well, it's about 10%, 11% of healthcare spending. But if you throw in the institutional side of it, the drugs that are used in hospitals, you could get up to 15 or 16% of national health.
So about $500 billion is somewhere in the ballpark. What do you think the after-tax profitability in total of that amount is?
Well, it varies by sector. There are
I understand, but I mean, in total, would you say, again, total industry after-tax profitability is probably averages about 5%. Well, let's say drugs more, maybe it might be 10%.
Well, no, the pharmaceutical companies and the medical device companies clean up.
Okay,
They're
so would it be
they're in the low 20%.
Okay, so again, I'm talking about after-tax because let's face it,
true.
the tax that the government collects goes right back into our coffers as well. So let's say it's 20%.
Yeah.
On $500 billion, that's about $100 billion. On a total spend in healthcare about $4.3 trillion. So we're talking somewhere 2.5% in terms of profitability of the drugs, in terms of our overall healthcare spending. I make the point because it's easy for us to zero in on a particular problem. Again, I think PBMs, this is a really interesting hearing, okay? But you eliminate all the profitability and all the incentives for creating new drugs, you haven't really made a dent in our healthcare spend. Is that pretty accurate?
Well, the real issue now facing the Part D plans and their beneficiaries are the high-cost specialty drugs for which there are no competitors, and that's where the elderly are getting creamed in terms of their out-of-pocket costs. What we need there is more competition among those sorts of manufacturers.
There you go. Don't we also need more consumer involvement? I think, Mr. Gibbs, I think you were talking in your testimony that unlike every other product, and that may be a little bit too broad, but almost like every other product in our economy, we don't know what things cost in drugs. And again, I think that's a generally true statement, but I guess I would argue that the reason for that is because of the third-party payer system, where consumers pay about 10% of all of our goods and services in healthcare, 10%. Nobody cares what any of this stuff costs. If they did, you'd have price transparency just through the marketplace, correct? I mean, anybody want to disagree with that? How about the attorney who sues these guys?
No, I would totally agree with it, and it's basically if everybody's covered by insurance, and more than 90% of the population are, they don't really care about the cost.
So the solution, again, I would argue the biggest problem with PBMs is we have Medicare and their formularies, and it makes it so unbelievably complex. I'm an accountant, okay? I actually understand numbers. I understand. I've had people try and explain this to me, and like Professor Burns, you've written books on this stuff, and you're just sort of kind of getting your arms around this, okay? Markets are complex. If you let a competitive market system with consumers participating in it, you get price transparency just as a natural part of it, as opposed to trying to suss it out through government regulations, which we've been trying to do, and it just doesn't work.
Well, as I wrote in the textbook I published 2 years ago, consumerism and consumer literacy just haven't shown up yet.
So we do want drug companies to produce new molecules to save lives. I mean, we want that R&D. So there has to be a profit motive in there. One thing that I found out during the pandemic is how completely unlevel the playing field is between generics and the patentable drugs. Part of the problem is now it has to be random controlled trials is the only standard. They won't accept observational, meta-analysis of that. So the playing field is totally tipped toward patentable drugs, and so we're all these molecules that are there, doctors oftentimes can't use. And of course, we found with some generic drugs that my experience working with doctors worked really well in COVID. We're not allowed, and I'm highly concerned. I'm the author of Right to Try, I've also authored another bill now, right to treat. It shouldn't be necessary, but I get just your opinion in terms of allowing doctors to use their medical judgment. Something like 20% of all drugs are prescribed off-label. That's how you get generic drugs more readily used, more looked at by the medical profession, and hopefully with more observational studies to prove their efficacy or if there are problems with it. I mean, we've got to produce research on generics and try and use those as much as possible. Anybody want to argue with that?
Totally agree. The last thing you want to do is second guess what the doctors are doing at the bedside or the point of care. The thing I would have mentioned is that it's not necessarily patentable versus generic drugs. We oftentimes have a lot of biological drugs, specialty medicines that are off patent, and the price rises continue there because there are no effective competitors.
Yeah. So again, I'm a private sector guy. Competition solves an awful lot of problems, and we just don't have the competition, and certainly not in the PBM market. So again, I really do appreciate all your testimony here. This is very interesting. I wish it was a little bit clearer than mud. Maybe I missed some stuff, and maybe you clarified this entire issue. But again, I'll point out again, the marketplace, the third-party payer system, those are at odds in terms of transparency, and that's what we really need to move toward. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank my colleague. Ms. Feldman, my apologies. I think I didn't look down at the